On January 3, 2026, United States forces struck deep into Venezuelan territory, not to negotiate, not to impose sanctions, but to seize a sitting head of state. Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, was captured and flown to New York to face trial. The U.S. claims this was justice. Much of the world sees something else entirely: a violation of sovereignty on a scale rarely seen in modern history. To understand what just happened, we need to understand what Venezuela has, what Maduro did, and what happens when oil, power, and empire collide. Venezuela is home to 30 million people, but beneath its soil lies something far more valuable: the largest proven oil reserves in the world. 303 billion barrels. That's more than Saudi Arabia and Iran combined. Oil isn't just wealth, it's strategic leverage. Throughout history, nations have gone to war over it. Economies rise and fall on it. Global power itself runs on it. For decades, Venezuela's oil output has languished, barely a fraction of its potential. Mismanagement, corruption, and crippling international sanctions have strangled production. Fields that should be pumping millions of barrels sit underutilized. Infrastructure crumbles. Expertise flees. But the oil remains, and the world knows it. Let's be clear from the start. Nicolas Maduro is not a saint. When Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Maduro inherited power. What followed was economic catastrophe. Venezuela's economy shrank dramatically. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation. Basic goods disappeared from shelves. Healthcare systems collapsed. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, fled the country. Critics inside and outside Venezuela blame Maduro's policies for deepening the crisis. Allegations of corruption, suppression of dissent, and authoritarian governance have marked his tenure. Elections have been disputed, opposition leaders jailed, media silenced. Whether Maduro should have remained in power is a legitimate question. But that question was answered not by Venezuelan voters or international diplomacy. It was answered by military force. But the outcome is undeniable. President Maduro and his wife were taken into custody and transported to the United States. 2 days later, in a Manhattan federal court, Maduro stood before a judge. The charges? Narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and illegal weapons possession. Maduro pleaded not guilty. His lawyers made a stark claim. Their client had been kidnapped. They argued he was a prisoner of war, and that as a sovereign head of state, he could not be lawfully prosecuted by a foreign power. Legal experts immediately recognized the implications. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a challenge to centuries of international law governing state sovereignty and diplomatic immunity. The principle that one nation cannot simply seize another's leader by force, a principle established to prevent exactly this kind of power play, had been shattered. The United States framed the operation as law enforcement, the capture of a dangerous narco-terrorist who had turned Venezuela into a hub for drug trafficking. But the timing, scale, and aftermath tell a different story. Former President Donald Trump didn't hide his intentions. In public statements, he declared the U.S. would now run Venezuela. He invited American oil companies back in to fix and control Venezuela's oil infrastructure. The language was explicit. This wasn't about removing a criminal. It was about seizing control of the world's largest oil reserves. Energy analysts noted the obvious. Venezuela's production had collapsed under sanctions and mismanagement. Yet those reserves, the largest on Earth, remain untapped. For decades, U.S. oil companies had been locked out. Now, with Maduro removed and US influence established, that access suddenly opens. One energy analyst put it bluntly, "This isn't about drugs, it's about controlling the world's richest oil fields." The international response was swift and fierce. At the United Nations Security Council, nation after nation condemned the operation. Russia and China led the criticism, calling it a blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. Even some US allies expressed concern about the precedent being set. The principle at stake is foundational. If the world's most powerful nation can simply remove leaders it dislikes through military action, what prevents others from doing the same? What remains of sovereignty for smaller nations? Legal scholars pointed to the dangerous implications. If this action is normalized, any leader anywhere could potentially face extradition by force if a stronger power deems them a threat or criminal. Venezuela's interim government, recognized by some nations but not others, found itself in a precarious position, caught between domestic crisis and foreign intervention. But there's another dimension to this story that goes beyond oil extraction itself: the global financial system. For decades, oil has been traded primarily in US dollars. This arrangement, often called the petrodollar system, gives the United States enormous economic leverage. Nations need dollars to buy oil. That demand keeps the dollar strong and allows the US to run large deficits without consequences other countries would face. Venezuela, like several other nations, had been exploring alternatives, selling oil in currencies other than dollars, building trade relationships outside the Western financial system, challenging, even in small ways, the dominance of dollar-denominated oil markets. For analysts watching global finance, this pattern is familiar. When leaders move away from the dollar system, whether through alternative currencies, trade arrangements, or financial alliances, they often find themselves in conflict with Western powers. This doesn't mean conspiracies control everything. It means incentives align. Protecting the petrodollar system protects American economic power, and nations act in their perceived self-interest. Some critics go further, pointing not just at governments, but at global finance itself. Central banks, the IMF, the World Bank, and historic banking dynasties like the Rothschilds. Here, clarity matters. The Rothschild family was indeed pivotal in shaping early modern banking and international finance. Their influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries was substantial and well documented. But claims that a single family secretly controls all governments today are unsupported and often rooted in harmful conspiracy theories that distract from real analysis. Power in the modern financial system isn't hidden in one family. It's embedded in institutions, treaties, currency arrangements, and the structural advantages that come from controlling reserve currencies and international lending. Understanding those real mechanisms, how the IMF structures loans, how central banks coordinate policy, how trade agreements benefit certain nations over others, matters far more than chasing shadowy puppet masters. Whether Maduro is guilty of the charges against him will be determined in court. But the larger question isn't about his guilt or innocence. It's about what his capture represents. The United States now holds Maduro in custody. American influence over Venezuela's oil sector has dramatically increased. US oil companies are positioning to return, and the message to other nations is unmistakable. Sovereignty has limits when resources or geopolitical interests are involved. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people face an uncertain future. Their country remains in crisis. Infrastructure is broken. Millions remain in exile. And now, on top of internal chaos, they must navigate external powers competing for control of their nation's wealth. Oil fields that could fund schools and hospitals will likely enrich foreign corporations. The pattern is old, even if the players change. This isn't the first time oil has driven intervention. Iraq, Libya, and others have faced similar dynamics. Nations rich in resources, but unable to defend their sovereignty against more powerful states. The justifications vary. Sometimes it's weapons of mass destruction, sometimes terrorism, sometimes drugs, sometimes humanitarian intervention. But often, beneath those claims, sits the same strategic calculation. Control of resources equals power, and power, once achievable, will be pursued. International law exists to prevent this. The UN Charter explicitly prohibits the use of force to violate territorial integrity. Diplomatic immunity protects heads of state. These principles emerged from hard lessons about what happens when might makes right. Yet when those principles conflict with strategic interests, especially involving resources as valuable as oil, they bend. Sometimes they break entirely. The capture of Nicolas Maduro may mark a turning point. Not because it's unprecedented. History offers many examples of powerful nations overthrowing weaker ones. But because it happens so openly, with so little pretense. The United States didn't hide behind regime change or proxy forces. It simply took him. What this means for international norms, for smaller nations trying to maintain independence, for the basic concept that sovereignty matters, those questions are now unavoidable. As empire, economics, and raw power collide, we're forced to ask, who really governs the global order? On what terms does sovereignty exist? And what protections remain for nations that possess resources more powerful countries want? The oil remains in Venezuelan soil. The institutions remain in place. But the question of who controls that wealth and for whose benefit has been answered, at least for now. The world is watching, and the precedent is set.